Penzance bus station. Now today I'm going to be travelling on the extraordinary Land's End coaster from Penzance to, well, you guessed it, Land's End. Now, although this was filmed in early March of 2025, so the Land's End coaster was only operating its winter route, I was quite lucky to get on the Land's End coaster, since from April 2025 the Land's End coaster will no longer operate and will be rebranded as Services 1 and 1A. Now, I'm not too sure what the route is or the timetable, however, from what I can see, it will only be operating the winter route as it was back in March, between Penzance and Land's End, usually operating via the village of Porthcurno and St Just. This is quite a bad idea in my opinion, however I do recognise that in recent years, especially in 2024, I don't think the open toppers, especially in Cornwall, made that much money, which is why First Bus are shelving the open top routes. As well as this, the Mousel route, which at the moment is branded as the Mousel and is known as the Mousel, will become the M6, which I believe is what it used to be known as. Anyway, here at Penzance bus station, they have some of these quite cool destination screens, which you don't find at many places across Cornwall, usually only at some of the major central bus stations in central Cornwall. Anyway, my Land's End coaster service was, from memory, the 1625. It was sometime around 4:30, and this service actually originated from one of the colleges in the local area. So this service is quite unique. However, it will be operating along the usual route between Land's End and Penzance, running via Porthcurno. Now, I didn't film the return journey from Land's End, however, it does cut across the country and is the only service of the day to do that. Anyway, since First Bus in Cornwall have shelved all of their open toppers, my bus, as expected at this time of year, especially when it's raining, was a standard Porthcurno ADL Enviro 400 MMC. Now, this duty does change quite a bit, and quite often you'll find different vehicles doing this duty. Sometimes the vehicle would have been on other routes during the day, and sometimes this is the first and only run out of the depot that it does all day. Now, when I was filming this quite a few days ago, there were B7s and B9s on the route. However, unfortunately, to be honest, as expected, I ended up getting an MMC. Anyway, I'm not on this bus to enjoy the engine, I'm on this bus to enjoy the views. So let's head along now towards our first stop of Newlyn. Now on the outskirts of Penzance, passing Penzance Harbour and the famous Jubilee Pool. Now, it will be a shame that the Land's End coaster will be going, however I do believe that some of the summer services on the 1 and 1A will still be double deckers, so you'll be able to enjoy some of the lovely views of the many tourist attractions along the route, such as the Jubilee Pool. Now, to be honest with you, there isn't really a difference between Penzance and Newlyn. However, Newlyn does seem like quite a nice little village. However, some of the roads that the Land's End coaster used were quite narrow. However, I'm not too sure if the Land's End coaster, probably now the 1 and 1A services, will be operating via Newlyn on a regular basis, or if this is just a college route. Anyway, here we are now in the centre of Newlyn at one of the unmarked bus stops. There are loads of these across Cornwall, especially in the Penzance area and in other rural areas across the county, whether or not you're in a town or a village. Yeah. Yeah. It's more kind of more students. Well, actually, just say that you've got the sports side. You've got all the details. Just outside of Newlyn in the local area. I'm pretty sure only a handful of Lands End Coaster services use this stretch of road in each direction, with most of the other Lands End Coaster services using the A road in the local area that we will soon be linking up with. In southern Cornwall. After the small clump of villages around Newlyn, Poole and the village of Sheffield that we just passed through, it gets pretty sparse, with there only being a handful of villages in the local area, let alone towns, with the only major town in the area being St Just, which is quite a way away. Here we are on one of the very isolated stretches of the route between Sheffield and Porthcurno, and here we are meeting a police car of all things coming the other way. I wouldn't imagine to see a police car on one of these narrow lanes anywhere in the country, let alone in this very isolated part of Cornwall. However, imagine being in the police car and meeting this absolutely gigantic double-decker bus barreling its way down the lane. That must be quite terrifying, especially on one of these small lanes, to be completely honest with you. Along with Porthcurno and Sennon Cove on the other part of the route, this is one of the only major villages along the route. Now I do apologise if earlier in the video I said that the Land's End coaster went to St Just, I meant Sennon Cove. I do apologise. However, in the summer months, I do believe that the Land's End coaster used to, and it might do this year as part of the 1 and 1A summer route, serve the main town of St Just. Anyway, I thought St Barrion was quite a nice village. However, I wouldn't want to live in these parts of the country, especially this far south, when even in Penzance, you're quite far away from any form of major city, let alone the capital, which is a 5-hour train ride away, let alone taking the National Express coach, which takes pretty much all day. Near the small village of Tradui, I really hope I'm pronouncing that right, to head down to another small village which is very quaint and has some absolutely stunning views of Porthcurno, which is where the bus does a U-turn. Now when we get to the small village of Porthcurno, the bus doesn't actually go right into the centre of the village where the main attractions and beaches are located. We stop at a sort of park and ride area just outside the village, where there is quite a new bus shelter by the looks of it. Anyway, before we get to Porthcurno, enjoy the coast road down to the village and the absolutely amazing views. now arriving at the main stop, and I think the only stop in Porthcurno. As I started filming, the bus unexpectedly started to turn around at this car park where I didn't notice there was a very new bus shelter and bus stop. Now I think this is the main bus stop and the only bus stop in the village, and is sometimes used, especially in the summer, as a sort of park and ride location to head off to Land's End. Now I was expecting the Land's End coaster bus to head into the village itself to where the beach is located. However, looking on Google Maps, it doesn't actually look like there's anywhere to turn around, and it just looks like the road is a dead end. After all, Porthcurno is located in a very steep valley. Anyway, this was pretty much the final village now, and we're on the home stretch to Land's End. Arriving at the main attraction, especially on the winter route, as well as the summer route pretty much, and this is where the iconic bus, which is to be no more, actually gets its name from. This is of course Land's End. Now it's quite weird seeing all of this car park and hardly any of it being filled up. However, I do believe that in the summer it gets ever so popular with tourists here. However, I do believe that quite a lot of them actually travel down to Land's End on the open topper. However, it will be interesting to see how popular the 1 and 1A services are, especially in the summer months, since the service is not an open topper. I'm not too sure if the service will be a double-decker or single-decker. However, with the amount of double-deckers that First Bus have in this part of the country, I am expecting it to be a double-decker most of the time. Anyway, I actually have 12 minutes before the bus goes back to Penzance on a very short route which pretty much cuts across the countryside and isn't actually shown on the Land's End coaster map. Now, I do get why people visit Land's End. However, I'm not sure why you would stay here for hours and hours on end, like quite a lot of people do. I do believe there are some quite nice walks in the area to Sennan Cove, which I would actually quite like to spend a few hours at. However, at Land's End, there's not really much. There's a few iconic features, but that's about it. All you really need to do is to take a photograph and then head back on the bus to Sennan Cove, which in my opinion is much better. Now, although the scenery is pretty good on this route and the weather wasn't great, Sennan Cove and Land's End, even in the quite grey and ended up being quite rainy weather, it still looks pretty good. Anyway, that's enough of me waffling on about Land's End. I really hope you enjoyed this video. It's quite extraordinary to go on the Land's End coaster, especially considering that it will soon become the 1 and 1A services and will no longer be called the Land's End coaster. and I'll see you in the next one. Bye everyone!